if you want to look at personally, where people are harmed by products and money laundering with drug dealers.
Well, and I'll take it a step further on your point about bankers or people that commit these massive financial crimes. Not only are people not scared of them running into them in an alley, it's almost glorified. I mean, in American society, like money kind of is religion in 2025. So I mean, you look at, like The Wolf of Wall Street, that's a perfect example. Nobody watches that movie and is like, feels like they're going after, what's his name, Jordan Belfort. It's like, oh, this guy's the man. He ripped all these people off. He's got a yacht. He was talking shit to the cops. It's borderline horrifying to do this. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of the Saucetown Investor Podcast. I am your host, Matt Cox, and we are joined. I'm very, very excited about this guest that we have today. Our guest is a journalist and author of nonfiction books, including Damnation Island and The Restless Sleep. She has been hailed for combining off-field curiosity with top-flight reporting skills, and her work has been described as immaculately researched and several notches above the typical reporter's insights. I can agree with all those because I just read her book and it was awesome. Her commentaries have been heard on NPR's All Things Considered. Here to talk about her most recent book, The Killing Fields of East New York, I am joined by Stacy Horn. Stacy, how are you doing today?
I'm great. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. It's a beautiful day in Manhattan, and I just found out we're neighbors. So you're joining us from the West Village, correct?
Yes. And what are we doing inside on a day like today?
I know if I had known we were neighbors, I would have met you in the middle at Washington Square Park or something and recorded this with you.
Yeah,
It's so beautiful outside.
it is.
So wonderful to have you here. Like I said, I loved your book. So let's bust right into it. So this is actually a really unique story that I don't think has been told a whole lot. I've read a lot of financial books and financial scandal books about 2008, the housing crisis, and Enron and Bernie Madoff and various scandals, but I actually had never heard this story until I read your book. How did you land on this story, and what ultimately led you to write a book about it?
Yeah, this book, in many ways, the story came out of nowhere for me, and it's very unlike my previous books. But I had finished Damnation Island, and my publisher, we were going back and forth about what my next book would be, and they turned down every proposal I submitted to them. And so they finally said, "Would you consider writing a true crime book? Because true crime books sell."
Mhm.
And I'm not really a true crime person. I did not want to write a true crime book. But when I wrote The Restless Sleep, which is a book about the NYPD's cold case squad, and there are a bunch of detectives that go back to try to solve old unsolved homicides. In the process of researching that book, I learned that East New York, which is in Brooklyn, has the highest number of unsolved homicides. So as soon as I never forgot that. So as soon as she said that, I'm thinking, no, but that's kind of interesting. Like, why East New York? I mean, I guess it's a bad neighborhood, but it's certainly not the only bad neighborhood in New York. Why does that particular neighborhood have the highest number? And I thought maybe there's a story there. And so I knew almost nothing about East New York at the time, and in my head I had that idea that East New York is a bad neighborhood, and I thought that it was always a bad neighborhood, but when I looked into it, I very quickly learned that it was actually a nice neighborhood. It was like a middle class, working class neighborhood up until the 1940s and 1950s, and then in the 1960s it just tanked. It just went off the deep end, and very, very quickly. And I came across a book, How East New York Became a Ghetto. Uh, and he lays it at the door of these two pieces of legislation that passed in 1968, but he doesn't say what they are. So I started researching it. I learned what they are, and I learned about this white collar crime, set of white collar crimes that were happening nationally, not just in East New York. And when I looked into it, I said, oh my God, this is a subprime mortgage crime. And it sounds exactly the same, like a less sophisticated version of the one that happened in 2000, well, culminated in 2007 and 2008. And I just got so excited because there was one thing. I'm not interested in true crime, but when my book about, and this might, I'll be interesting to hear your response to this, but when my book about unsolved murder came out, it was 2005, and there was a very big white collar case going on at the time. I can't remember if it was WorldCom or which one it was, but it was
And Enron, maybe?
yeah, maybe. Um, it was a big case, and I didn't know a lot about white collar crime, but it just, because I had just come off researching unsolved murder, and I'd spent a couple of years researching like everything there is to know about murder, and in particular which murders don't get solved. And there's a ton of information out there. I can find out if I want, all the murders in the United States, no matter how small the town or city is, for any year, and how many went to trial, how many convictions, and how many are unsolved. There's just a lot out there. So when I got interested, I thought, I wonder how many white collar crimes there are. Like, here's this big prosecution. Like, I don't usually follow it. How many prosecutions are there? Like, how big is white collar crime? And so I called up everyone I could think of, every law enforcement arm that would be going after white collar crimes. So I called the FBI, I called the Department of Justice, I called DAs, the SEC, everyone I could think of that should be able to tell me how much white collar crime is out there. And no, so again, this is around 2005. I said, like, how many white collar crimes are being committed every year? How many arrests are made? How many convictions? And nobody can answer any of those questions, even for their own institution. And it wasn't like they were trying to hide that information from me, because just saying we don't know was bad. And they just said, we don't have it. We're not, collecting data for that. We don't have a database for that. And I just thought, well, that's kind of insane. Like, so basically nobody in the United States can tell me how bad white collar crime is. And that just stuck with me, because I'd been researching murder, and I don't want to be misunderstood. Murder is bad. Murder is really, really bad, but it's a very contained crime. Like, if I murder you, it's bad for you and your friends and loved ones, but it just doesn't go further than that. These people are committing crimes that hurt people and society in a much bigger and extensive way. And it just seemed unfair that we're throwing billions at people that we should be, arresting, but some of them, their crimes are so small that why are we putting so much time into catching these particular criminals, and how much are we putting into catching these other guys? So that kind of stayed with me. So when I saw that East New York was destroyed, and it was because of white collar crime, I thought, oh my God, this is the book I've been waiting to write. I've been when I learned this back in 2005, I couldn't interest any of my friends. Like, they didn't think, well, so what? Who does white collar crime hurt? Yes, it's financial, but it's not as bad as murder. So we understand. And I thought, no, it's worse, really. So I thought, this is the book I've been looking for. That's how I came to write the book.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think, we'll get into more of the actual mechanics of what happened here, but it's so kind of ambiguous. You don't really, there's all this terminology, and you're like, wait, they did a mortgage loan and somebody didn't pay it back. It's very convoluted. It's not like when you're on the subway and you see somebody's purse get snatched. That's right there. Everybody can go, yep, purse snatch, that is bad, you know? And so
Yeah.
it's very jargony, and it's difficult to explain to people, which makes it not seem like as big a deal, I think, to some people that aren't, you know, experts on how mortgages work, or the terminology or the mechanics behind what actually went on in East New York. So to go back to the kind of the beginning here, you
Well,
touched
can I
on.
just address
Yeah,
that?
yeah,
Searching the book was
please.
a nightmare for me because I had no background in all this terminology. I've never bought a house. I mean, it was so dense to me. So I recognized immediately that that was going to be my biggest challenge, was making this not dense and jargony and making it as clear as someone's purse being snatched on the subway.
Yeah, so let's go into you touched on, you know, East New York was not always this rough neighborhood with all this violence and violent crime. And things you mentioned, things kind of start to change pretty drastically in the 60s. I mean, this is the time of President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society Initiative. The Fair Housing Act is passed in 65, I believe it was,
68.
and 68, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
And so behind these initiatives, there's a ton of effort to put money into the inner cities, not just East New York, but across America, and even to put money into some of the worst slums in America. So we look at this, and on the surface, of course, you know, that's great. You know, if this is done properly, this is going to be a great thing for our American cities. So if things had gone right, if HUD and the FHA had done what they were supposed to do and what was intended to be done, what was their role supposed to be here? We'll talk about what actually happened, but what were they supposed to do?
Well, that's what kills me is like, had these criminals not defrauded these programs, I'm not saying that they would have solved society's problems, but it would have been an extremely important step forward. And we've been suffering as a result. Like, certain very bad things about society have continued unabated, trace back to this. I mean, it wasn't the origin of the problem, but it was such a horribly important missed opportunity. It just breaks my heart every time I think of it. But so in 1968, these two acts passed. The Civil Rights Act of 1968, which made housing discrimination illegal, and the Housing and Urban Development Act of 1968, which created these programs that made it easier for families of color to buy homes. And those were the acts that were defrauded by the criminals that I write about in the book. And now I've forgotten your question.
So my question was, if these programs had been executed the way they were supposed to, they were intended to be executed, what we'll talk about what actually happened in a minute. But what was the intention here? How was this program supposed to work as far as giving people money and helping them buy
Well,
houses?
these programs are actually very similar to other programs that were already in place that helped white families buy home, and which were supposed to also be helping families of color to buy homes. But I think 3% were used for families of color. But the FHA were just given in no uncertain terms. It is now your mission to help families of color. And so the only differences were a smaller down payment, a longer time to pay off the mortgage, and for some of the programs, the government would help with the interest on the loans. That was it, really. And to go after families in the inner city, like East New York, um, but the criminals took one look at that act and just said, we can sell these homes, we'll slap a little. No, well, I should backtrack. So it was supposed to be done just the way the FHA had always been insuring mortgages. They would look at the home, appraise it. If there was anything wrong, they would make a list of what would need to be fixed before they would insure this mortgage, and they would state the value of the home. And so now do you want me to get into what really happened?
Yeah. So, and just to kind of recap what you said, so the FHA, these FHA loans have been around since the 30s. It's
Yes.
just they've gone almost exclusively to white families, and this came about. So, if you go back before the 30s, some of these mortgages were on like 5-year amortizations, and they were you kind of, it made it very difficult because you had to pay. Today we get 30-year mortgages, and you
Yeah.
pay a little bit each month, and then they become, because of the Housing Act of 1968, these become not just available to minorities, but actually really pushed by the Johnson administration to get these things out there to people of color and help
Yeah.
them buy houses. So, okay, so let's go. Now we're in the late 60s, and this initiative has started. Let's take us through the exact kind of mechanics of how this fraud was perpetuated.
Well, it's really very simple. They targeted neighborhoods of color and where immigrants were, because they knew that this is where the FHA was anxious to insure mortgages. And because of previous white collar crimes, I talk about the fact that places like East New York suffered 3 crime waves. First crime wave was blockbusting, where realtors would basically hound white homeowners into selling their homes by frightening them with the idea that black families and families of color would move in, and crime would go up, property values would go down. And they really did hound them. Like, I talked to the children whose parents were hounded, and they said they would call constantly, knock on the door, send letters, send postcards. They didn't just like try once. They would just go after and after and after. And many people finally did give in and sell their homes. And once these neighborhoods became primarily neighborhoods of color, banks would redline them, literally draw red lines on maps around these neighborhoods, and would not insure mortgages or grant or provide other financial services. And that would these 2 acts would cause neighborhoods to begin to decline. And the criminals from the FHA scandal took advantage of that. They were able to pick up homes at lower prices, and these homes had started to deteriorate. And instead, so the FHA would go in and say, the boiler doesn't work, you have to fix or replace the boiler. The roof has holes in it, you have to fix that before we insured the mortgage. But they had already met and established relationships with FHA appraisers, where they would pay them, and the appraisers would sign off on fixes that didn't take place. So they would just slap a coat of paint on it and make cosmetic changes, but not any of these big structural changes. And then they would, in addition, value the home for much more. Like, I looked into it, and what they were valuing these homes for were what you would pay for a very nice home in the suburbs, not for basically a slum in the city. So then they would target immigrants and families of color, and I saw that often, like, people would go in and say, I want to rent a home, and they would say, hey, why rent it? You can buy it, for $200 down, and you have a home, and you don't have to deal with landlords anymore. And they would misrepresent the financial responsibilities and everything else, and they would inflate the person's income. So the FHA would have something on paper that established that they could afford to keep up with the mortgage.
And
And
Stacy, didn't you say in the book, speaking of the renting part, there were even examples of people that thought they were signing paperwork to rent a house and they were buying, right?
yeah, and they went after people who didn't speak English and had
Yeah.
no idea what they were signing. And I had this in the book because there was a movie made of the 2007-2008 financial crisis, The Big Short. Did you
Uh-huh.
see that?
Of course. Yeah, that's a classic.
Well, there was there was a Senate investigation, and there was one part back in the 1970s of the case that I wrote about, And this one guy talked about bringing realtors in because they discovered that they were selling homes to people who didn't have jobs, and so they bought all these realtors in to explain what was happening, and the guy just started saying what he was doing, and he was admitting to crimes, and so the guy goes, "Don't you want a lawyer?" And he goes, "Everyone's doing it." And he just went ahead fearlessly thinking, I'll just be fine. And he was. I have no record of that guy ever going to jail. But so I and the guy just couldn't believe it. He's going, "You realize that these people are poor people, like people who have nothing." And
That's
now,
the Steve Carell line. He goes, he's not confessing, he's bragging.
yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And
Yeah.
so I put that in the book. And Steve Carell had the same reaction, like, do these people know what they're getting into, what they're signing? And the guy goes, we just tell them they're going to get home and they'll sign anything, which was a similar situation in the 1970s. Like, a lot of these people probably were very enticed by the idea of finally owning a home and were willing to sign anything.
Yeah, so just to give some like kind of basic numbers on how this might work. This is the 70s, so or the 60s or 70s. So you might tell me if I'm right here, Stacy. Kind of pulled it from your book. You might get a house that's worth $12,000, let's say, and you get an appraiser to go out there and appraise it at 25 grand. So
Exactly.
you
That's
go
the general ballpark.
so you go take the money in the middle here. There's a 13 grand spread there. You've got enough to pay off the appraiser, pay off the underwriter, pay off everybody else. And the thing that makes this all work, though, is because you hear this, you'll go, okay, well, what happens when they default on the loan? These
They
are
want them
loans.
to default.
These are loans that are backed by the U.S. government. So as
Yeah.
soon as these, and in the at the time, there were a lot of banks. They were called mortgage banks. They didn't actually hold people's money. They just literally all they did was originate mortgages. So as soon as one of these loans closed, they didn't care what happened afterward. They've already gotten paid. The realtors gotten paid. Everybody's got their cut. And then what might happen, one of the craziest parts of your book is some of these banks, they would loan the money. The borrower would inevitably not be able to pay, so they would foreclose on it, and then they would just repeat the process again.
Yes.
Then they'd go pick
Yes.
it up and sell it to somebody else. Did I miss anything there?
No, exactly.
Hey guys, we're taking a quick break, but before we get back into it, if you're enjoying this episode, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. It really helps us to keep bringing you more valuable content. And if you're on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, don't forget to leave a review. Please, it makes a huge difference. All right, let's get back to it. Yeah. Okay. So you write this book, and it's a really interesting kind of structure that you use. And I'll reiterate, everybody listen should go out and buy it. But you kind of alternate chapters between what's going on with the white collar crime, and then the next chapter will be about the violent crime that it leads to. And sometimes you're jumping, the white collar crime that occurred in the 70s, but here's the impact it's still having in 1991 to this murder. What actually happened? Because you talked about this at the start of our interview, that a lot of people look at white collar crime and they're kind of like, oh, well, it's just money. It's not, nobody's getting killed over this. And it's not really true. So take us through what actually happens in these neighborhoods when all this money is getting lended to all these people that can't afford to pay. What happens to the neighborhood? And then long term, how does this lead to violence and the overall deterioration of the neighborhood?
Well, that you exactly just summed up my book. I wanted to write a book that would show just the aftermath of white collar crime and just how destructive it is. And so the book has two threads. One is the financial crimes, the discovery of the crimes, the investigation, and the prosecution. And then I show the aftermath in East New York, where all these crimes occurred. And I picked, this all came back to, unsolved murders. So I picked one unsolved murder, a 17-year-old girl, Julia Parker, whose father was Black and her mother was Puerto Rican. And the story begins with her murder. and then I go back. That's like the prologue, and then so the two threads begin. One tracking her birth in East New York, and then following the crimes happening, and then as you know, as they're investigating the crime, I'm showing East New York chapter by chapter, step by step, showing it deteriorate, showing what's going wrong, and showing why, and why I'm saying it's directly connected to these financial crimes. And the funniest thing, like the FHA at the time had a stipulation that before so if a bank forecloses on the building, the FHA takes possession, but they would not take possession unless the building was vacant. And this was a particularly cruel stipulation, just because one of the things that families would often do would be taking renters. These were 2 and 3 family buildings. So they would take in renters for one of their floors who would be, paying their rent, religiously month after month, and they would get evicted when this would happen, even though they didn't do anything wrong. So the people of East New York took the FHA to court about this vacancy rule, saying abandoned buildings are spreading blight in our neighborhood, and this is one of the things I show. So buildings were abandoned in the thousands, and this happened very quickly, just because a lot. When that guy said everyone is doing it, he was right. Like, I use a company called the Eastern Service Corporation as my main villain in
Yeah.
my book, and I've got like 2 or 3 sub-villains, but they were just the largest. They were I'll never forget this, and I don't know if this is interesting to anyone, but the municipal archives downtown is where a lot of the records for the city of New York, historical records, are stored. And so there you can look at property cards for all the buildings in East New York for this period of time. So I had a pile of property cards just going through East New York, and I saw up until 1968, the buildings had been owned by one family for decades. Like, these homes weren't bought and sold a lot. And then all of a sudden in 1968, everyone was selling their building. And I was looking at that before I understood exactly what the crime was and what was happening, but I saw this was evidence of it. And then once I knew better, I went back and looked, and of course Eastern Service was all over these cards, but they weren't the only ones. Single, like a realtor who's just, a one-man shop was doing it. Everyone who was buying and selling and could figure out this crime, which was very easy to figure out, was doing it, and across the United States. And that was another thing I tried to do in the book. Like, even though East New York was my focus, I would every once in a while just pop back and go, oh, by the way, there's 50 prosecutions in Detroit, and so on.
Yeah. Do you want to tell us a little bit? You mentioned the kind of sub villains. There's a couple realtors here that are just some of the most slimy characters you'll ever hear of. You want to tell us a little bit about those people?
I can. I wasn't able to find out a lot about them. Everything I knew was from the point of view of the FBI and the prosecutors. So I saw that side. Not that it wasn't valid, but I wasn't like, why? Like, how did they become the people that they were? I couldn't find. They're all dead, and I couldn't find their families or anyone that was willing to speak to me about them. So I'll never know why. Like, who does this? I couldn't answer that question. But they did seem utterly, utterly heartless. Like, it's not that they didn't know what was happening. It was right there in front of them. Every time they would go through the neighborhood, they could see the destruction. The families. Oh, I totally forgot about the vacancy rule thing. Can we go back to that?
Yes, please. Yes. I was going to just ask you about that.
So the people of East New York sued the FHA over the vacancy rule, and the FHA fought them. And it was so ironic because they had this newsletter, this in-house newsletter. I think it was called the HUD Challenge. And the very year that they're fighting the vacancy rule, they have a big article in the HUD Challenge talking about how vacant buildings spread blight in every neighborhood where they appear. You know, a certain number of vacant buildings will lead to more vacant buildings, more crime. I mean, everything that I'm stating and trying to prove, they're already saying, yeah, we know. And yet they're fighting it.
Yeah, there's just, I mean, you can obviously read the book, but there's such a compounding effect, like you said, of vacant buildings lead to more vacant buildings. And I mean, there's some pretty heinous crimes that occur. And I mean, there's people getting thrown off the top of buildings. It's
raped in abandoned buildings, murdered in abandoned buildings. I mean, they're terrible on any way you look at it. I talked to a bunch of police and detectives who worked in East New York, and they were afraid to go into the abandoned buildings, and they were instructed to never go into an abandoned building alone and not without backup on the way. Even if you're with your partner, you don't do it without backup.
Yeah, and there was stuff, a fire would occur in East New York, and the streets, the neighborhood had to raise money just to put street signs up. There were no street signs, which obviously causes more problems because people can't find where buildings are if there's a fire or if a crime occurs. All this stuff just
Exactly.
piles
Or if
on
an
top of each
ambulance
other.
needs to come get you, they
Yeah,
can't find you. It, I don't know if you want to talk about this, but when I started writing this book, I really didn't know what the story was, and I learned as I went along. But I remember thinking, it might be a little bit about racism. I mean, yes, I knew the racism element about discrimination, and I knew about housing discrimination, but I didn't know the racism element of the financial crimes. And then I didn't consider the racism issue in the lack of response to these crimes and to the decline in East New York, that racism actually contributed to it.
that's what I took away from your book. Is it's a story of human greed for sure, but
Yeah,
it's also a story of racism. I mean, there's a reason this stuff was allowed to happen in this neighborhood, and it's not
exactly.
hard to read between the lines as to why this wasn't. There's plenty of places where you can commit fraud or take money, and it's certainly occurred before, but there's a reason that no one was paying attention to what was
Yeah,
going on here in East New York, and
yeah,
it's race. I mean, if this was
yeah,
a neighborhood of white people that was just disintegrating and
yeah.
becoming vacant and murder rate was through the roof, none of this stuff happens.
It's a nightmare, and there is no way I could exaggerate it. In fact, some of my early readers were so oppressed by it, we had to take stuff out because we thought people are just going to put this down like it was bad. I can't take it and there were some really ugly stories I took out just to get people to finish the book. And these were these people's lives. I just can't imagine.
Yeah, I can't imagine the ones you took out because the book itself is. I mean, it is hard to read at times. It's pretty awful what occurred there, and so I mean, I certainly racism was 100% a story here. I don't want to discount that, and this wouldn't have happened in a white neighborhood. But there's also, of course, the economic discussion here around moral hazard. In essence, just making loans that you ultimately don't have to collect on if the borrower defaults. That's the definition of moral hazard, right? You're incentivized to make this loan because you don't take on any of the downside risk. There's some similarities actually to what's happened more recently with the student loan crisis. It's the same. In that sense, it's the same thing. Loans are getting initiated by universities that they don't ultimately, it doesn't matter to them if the student defaults because the government has already backed them. So, I mean, and then of course, 2008 is similar as well. I mean, so anytime, there's a really good interview at the end of the book that you do with Anthony Acetta, who was the prosecutor in this case, and he kind of concedes that anytime government money flows in somewhere, there is going to be opportunity for fraud. We saw it with like the COVID loans. I mean, it happens all the time.
I
So
just can't get over it, though. People are evil. We suck.
yeah. So that's
End
so,
the
so
world.
that's my question, is because it's, maybe this is cynical, but humans are greedy, and when money starts flowing in somewhere, it is ripe and open for fraud. And now I don't think the answer here is to just like stop giving out government money, because we need it. Like the
No.
FHA has done a ton of great things, but like what is the answer here? Like
The
what?
answer is to actually investigate and prosecute these guys to the extent that you prosecute street criminals. If you did, there would be less white collar crime. But not only are we not doing that, we now have an administration saying, don't, stay away from white collar crime, go after immigration.
Right. Like where is it's kind of a story of incentives, right? Like if the worst for a lot of these criminals, if the worst thing that happens to you is you get a little fine or something, or maybe you do a few months in prison, that's not going to make people,
No,
it's not going to be enough to turn them away from
no.
doing stuff like
You
this.
have to send them to jail, and you have to
Yeah.
send them to bad jails, not, these minimum security jails that white collar criminals, if they ever get sentenced, go to. You have to put them in Rikers, fill Rikers up with bankers.
Yeah, because if you're getting fined, I mean, we see this with corporations or anybody. It's the fine is just a line item. Like, okay, cool, we'll just include that in our, in our financials for the year. We'll budget for the fine that we have to pay, and we'll keep doing business the same way. So it is. I mean, a perfect example of that is like Michael Milken, he was the junk bond guy he did 10 years in prison. You start putting people in prison for 10 years, they're not going to do this stuff anymore. You tell them they're going to get fined a few $1,000,000 and they make 100 million on the way to doing it. Where do you think they're going to go?
Yeah. No, I've been starting to track white collar crime more. In fact, I think Track is the name of one of the places that puts a lot of this information together. And white collar crime investigation and prosecution has been going down for a long time, but it's now really going down. It's been going down, since Tony prosecuted the FHA. And there was a period where it went up a little bit. I'm trying to remember during Clinton, but who was very soft on crime, financial crime, I should say. And the second George Bush, the younger, the son, it went
Mhm.
up a little bit during him. And then Obama, it was kind of mixed. Certain crimes were prosecuted, but then he didn't go after any of the criminals that were responsible for the 2007, 2008
Yeah,
financial
one guy went to
crisis. Yeah,
prison. That's
right.
yeah.
That just kills me. I love Obama, but it breaks my heart, his response.
Yeah, I mean, like we said, people are simple. If the incentives are pushing them towards being able to do this stuff, they're going to do it. And if there's no prison time, it's they're going to keep doing this stuff until people start getting locked up for it, and that just isn't happening.
Well, that's not going to change it right now because, again, I don't want to make this political, but the current administration not only is not prosecuting, giving the DOJ instructions to not go after these white collar cases, he's talking about this openly. So he's basically telling white collar criminals, go ahead, we're not coming after you.
Yep, it definitely seems like open season right now. So I work in real estate, which I told you
I know.
offline. So I deal with home loans all the time. I deal with FHA loans all the time. In fact, we actually got an offer on a house today from a buyer who's using an FHA loan. And one thing I always tell people is that the loan process these days, and the FHA loan process in particular, seems very stringent. It feels like we've maybe learned from the 70s or late 60s, 70s, and then also learned from 2008. Like it's hard to get a home loan now. And these, particularly FHA, in fact, if you get an FHA buyer, you know that somebody's going to come in there and they're going to really, dot their I's and cross their T's. With that said, I mean, humans are still susceptible to greed and bribery. I mean, there's plenty of appraisers out there. If you showed up with a check for them, they would probably do whatever you wanted them to do. But I don't know how closely you pay attention to like real estate or home loans these days. But do you see anywhere that you're like there might be cracks in the system, or where you worry something similar could happen again?
I am. This isn't my area of expertise. I'm more of an historian, but Jeff Kay, one of the FBI guys that I wrote about in my book, went on to become a federal prosecutor. And then in Florida, he was he was the head of the Economic Crimes Division. I don't know if that's the exact right title. He's retired now, but he keeps up with it, and he keeps sending me links of what's going on, which indicate to him that this is all going to happen again. He doesn't know if it's going to be mortgage crimes, but he's seeing an uptick in fraud in mortgage loans.
Wow. So what would for people that read your book, maybe we sort of answered this, but what would you ultimately like people to have taken away from it when they're done reading this book?
I want them to be enraged about the injustice in the justice system in that white collar crimes criminals get away with it. I mean, really, I've said this over and over. All a white collar criminal has to do to get away with a crime is commit it. Nobody's going to come after them. I mean, again, I've started tracking it, and every year the number of cases go down, and it's really plummeting. And it's so unfair. Like there are stories after stories of like kids who are hounded and thrown into Rikers for very minor crimes. I'm not talking about murders now, but
Yeah.
it's just, oh God, I'm too old. Like my brain doesn't function. But there was a kid who was thrown into Rikers for stealing a backpack, which it turns out he didn't actually steal. And he was in Rikers for years and ultimately committed suicide. It was a horrible story. And he's just one of many. He's just one that we've heard about.
Yeah, steal a few $100 million from a neighborhood, and it's a statistic. But if you grab somebody's backpack, that's and it goes back to what we were saying at the beginning of our talk today. It when you see somebody snatch a purse or a backpack or whatever, it's right there in front of you. It's very easy to see this is bad. But when these complex financial instruments get involved, it's very hard for the public to really get, first off, understand what's going on, and then be able to decipher like how damaging this stuff is.
But we're steeped in this since birth. Like there are millions of television shows about crimes, but it's always street crimes.
Yeah.
There's no banking. Are there? Has there ever been? Except for like Succession, and that isn't really.
It's not about crimes. Yeah,
No,
I
it's
mean,
not.
they're all
But
true crime. They don't do fiction about it. You're right.
we grow up like feeling like murderers and bad guys, street criminals are all over the place, and we're in danger. And it's why people will believe immigrants are eating dogs, or there's a child pornography ring in a pizza parlor. Like we've grown up in such a way, like television, newspapers, radio, books, everything is about this kind of crime. So people are, these villains are bad and scary, but bankers, not bad, not scary. Like we wouldn't be afraid of, running into a banker, in a dark alley. They're just not. They're not ever present. We don't know. They don't know. It's not something they've seen again and again and again their entire lives. And the outcome, and I'm just talking, my book is about financial crimes. There's all sorts of white collar corporate crimes that are much more devastating if you want to look at personally, where people are harmed by products and money laundering with drug dealers.
Well, and I'll take it a step further on your point about bankers or people that commit these massive financial crimes. Not only are people not scared of them or running into them in an alley, it's almost glorified. I mean, in American society, like money kind of is religion in 2025. So it's, I mean, you look at, like The Wolf of Wall Street. That's a perfect example. Nobody watches that movie and is like, it feels like they're going after what's his Jordan Belfort. Nobody's it's like, oh, this guy's the man. He ripped all these people off. He's got a yacht. He's talking shit to the cops. It's borderline glorified to do this stuff. Not only is it not
you make a good point.
It's kind of cool. People think it's awesome, and it's, I don't know how to deprogram that, because it's kind of the dark side of, we're a mega capitalist country, and that makes, a lot of great things come from. I'm a capitalist to the max, but there are side effects of that, this idolatry of money, that it makes this stuff seem harmless, or like it's kind of just an accepted part of society. Like, oh, that guy's cool because he did what he had to do to get to the top, and now he's got all this money, and it's glorified in our society.
Well, I hope my book is a correction to that.
I certainly took that away from it, and I had, like I said, I don't know if saying I had a blast reading it is the right way to put it. It was an awesome book. So before we let you go, Stacy, you've been super generous with your time. First off, we'll share it in the show notes, but where can people buy your book? And then also, where can people follow you? I don't know if you do social media or have a website or anything like that.
I'm pretty much everywhere. I Blue Sky, X, Instagram, Threads, Facebook. I have a website, stacyhorn.com. And my book, you should be able to buy it wherever you buy books. You can buy it online. You should probably still be able to buy it in the bookstore.
I've got the autographed copy right here from Strand.
Oh my God. What's so funny is like my actual autograph is illegible. But when I'm signing books, I have to do it very slowly and carefully so people can actually read my name.
Yeah, I was gonna say that one looks really good. I kind of do the scribble thing. It looks very nice. So, all right, Stacy. Well, thank you so much again for your time today. Everybody, go out and buy The Killing Fields of East New York. It's an incredible book, and Stacy is a wonderful writer. So, Stacy, thanks again for making time for us today.
Thank you for having me.
That is a wrap for today's episode. Thanks for tuning in to the Saucetown Investor. If you got value from this, drop us a comment and let us know your thoughts. Did you have a big takeaway? Is there a topic you want to see us cover next time? Is there a guest you want to see interviewed? DMs are open. Business is at Saucetown Properties, and my personal, you can DM me personally, is at The Real Matt Cox 4. We'd also like to ask you kindly to please like and subscribe. You can also follow along with the Saucetown Investor blog. That's mattcox444.substack.com. Thanks again, guys, and until next time, keep investing and stay saucy, Saucetown.